Hi everyone, so let's look at our next component part of aggregate demand, and that is government expenditure. Okay, so when it comes to government expenditure, you must bear in mind that this is an injection into our circular flow of income, yet it must be financed through taxation or alternatively borrowing. So let's take a look. Firstly, you must understand this important calculation here. Very simple calculation. It's just about the government's fiscal position. Fiscal policy is something you'll spend a great deal of time looking at in the course. Now, fiscal policy simply consists of government spending and taxation, and how the government actually generates tax income. So we can see here that the fiscal budget consists of tax revenue minus government spending. So therefore, if the government spends more than they actually earn in tax revenue in any given period, they will run a fiscal budget deficit. That's currently to the tune of £80 billion in the UK. Now therefore, that budget deficit must be financed. That fiscal budget deficit must be financed through borrowing. Okay, if the government were to reduce government spending or massively increase the tax revenue there, then you can see that actually if tax revenue is greater than government spending, you'd run a surplus, a fiscal budget surplus. Okay, so this is important when you consider proposing any potential increase in government spending to perhaps counteract the impact of a recessionary period or a slump and so on. Okay, so let's have a look at the different types of government expenditure that can be undertaken here. First one is about current expenditure. This is year-on-year provision of public services. So it's about providing pure public goods and quasi-public goods. Examples there, of course, would include things like street lighting, emergency services, as well as providing education, healthcare. So if the government actually decides to take on 5,000 new nurses, 2,000 new doctors, or so on, of course they must understand that this is an annualised commitment that will need to be made next year, the year after, in 5 years' time, and so on. So this isn't too popular at the moment, so increasing the current expenditure is not something you often hear about in the news these days. Okay, then there's capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is different in this nature because it's about longer term investment in the potential supply side of the economy through infrastructure as an example, or alternatively in building new hospital or new schools and so on. So yeah, capital expenditure, as we've seen in our previous lessons on investment, refers to investment, and this can help to improve the productive capacity of the economy in the longer term. Thirdly, we've got transfer payments, which are really payments transferring income from one group which has been taxed to another group which is perhaps in receipt of welfare payments or pensions. Okay, now let's just have a look at the reasons for government spending and why the government needs to actually have a role in providing any spending in the economy. First point I've put down there is really a Keynesian argument. So John Maynard Keynes argued that at times of economic difficulty, so in a slump or a recession where economic growth is negative, you can inject money into the macro economy and boost aggregate demand to achieve full employment. So that is that everyone who wants to find a job can actually find a job. Of course, Keynes also argued that there would be a multiplier effect, and that multiplier effect would lead to a larger increase in the total size of income due to the reverberations caused by that multiplier effect. Okay, next up we can also see that government expenditure can help to correct market failures. So if you consider here what we've mentioned with regard to transfer payments there, then it may well come under the guise of unemployment benefit or provision of particular financial payments to people who are less well off in society. So examples there could be about pupil premium payment that's actually provided to students from very low income backgrounds to ensure that they have access to revision guides, and additional support in schools. Okay, so that could be another area, but of course it could also be about addressing missing markets, such as the pure public and the quasi-public goods we mentioned here. Okay, thirdly, to improve the supply side of the economy. So we mentioned that in relation to our capital expenditure, that you can improve the supply side of the economy. Of course, that there's the HS2 project and the Northern Powerhouse, which was proposed and really took flight under David Cameron and George Osborne, and really they were thinking about actually rebalancing economic growth in the economy and trying to achieve a more prosperous northern economy. Okay, so this is interesting because if we just come back to the point about injecting money into the macroeconomy to boost aggregate demand, if your fiscal position is not that strong as the UK's isn't, then you're unlikely to want to actually increase current expenditure, and you're going to be more focused perhaps on increasing capital expenditure to help generate jobs in that particular area, but also it will have a longer term benefit on the economy. Okay, so that's an important point. Now, just in relation to this principle that Keynes argued, well, monetarists disagreed. They said actually what would take place when you actually conduct such injections into the macroeconomy is what would actually take place is crowding out. Okay, and this principle of crowding out, as we can see here, occurs when government expenditure raises borrowing costs, reducing private sector investment. Now, we've mentioned that the government runs a persistent fiscal budget deficit. That must be financed. Year on year, that deficit accumulates into an overall national debt. The UK's national debt is £1.7 trillion. So £1.7 trillion of borrowing. That is all borrowing. So that is borrowed money. That borrowed money means that there is an opportunity cost to it. It's not used by the private sector, it's used by the public sector. Okay, and in addition to that, well, monetarists argued no, it will actually raise borrowing costs because there's such a high demand for borrowing money. Okay, however, Keynesians argued that actually the private sector usually runs surpluses, so perhaps there is actually little effect given the nature of this crowding out. So yeah, it's an interesting argument. Okay, so John Maynard Keynes, he said no, crowding out doesn't occur because the private sector so often just runs a surplus, i.e. their spending is less than their income. Okay, so yeah, it very much depends on whose argument you want to take, but in an essay, how good to actually show understanding of both of those areas. So what about your evaluation here? Well, okay, how effective is any injection into the macroeconomy going to be? Well, it's going to depend upon the size of the multiplier, and the multiplier is determined, of course, by the size of the marginal propensity to consume. So that's really important. Okay, if you've got a small multiplier, then the actual impact of the injection is likely to be very small. Okay, likelihood of crowding out. So how likely is this scenario to play out, or is this more likely? Okay, so again, it's going to depend upon your viewpoint, but just posing that question is significant there. What about the potential for crowding in? So if the government chooses not to undertake a particular investment, does that mean that the private sector may actually undertake it? And so in which case, why is the public sector involved? HS2 as an example there is often criticised because there's no private sector involvement. Perhaps that's because the private don't believe it to be profitable though. That's another point anyway. Okay, and then we've got the fiscal deficit. So what will be the impact of any injection into the macroeconomy? Okay, and if financing and borrowing becomes a real problem and it looks like it's unsustainable, then you could have a fiscal budget crisis where you can no longer actually finance that debt, and that can pose all sorts of problems for the economy, as it did with Russia in 1998, and they ended up defaulting on their debt, as did Iceland in 2008. Okay, and then we've got the impact on the economy's productive capacity. Okay, so we mentioned this point, well, with regard to capital expenditure, can it improve the supply side of the economy? How likely is that? And what about the time lags and the velocity of circulation? The velocity of circulation. So let me give an example here just to understand that. When we bought our latest house, our house that we have now, we paid £16,000 in stamp duty. So £16,000 paid in stamp duty. That meant that we didn't actually buy curtains in the lounge for, I think it was about a year afterwards. Now, that £16,000 had been taken out of the circular flow of income. So how long was it before it would have been recycled? I know for sure that we would have spent that money otherwise very quickly within the real economy. So what sort of impact can government taxation actually have here, and how may that actually affect the ability to generate significant gains to our circular flow of income? Okay, interesting stuff, guys.